This is Red Ice Radio. My name is Henrik Palmgren. Welcome to all our listeners from around the world. RedIceCreations.com is the website. If you haven't already seen it, please take a look at our new TV episode, number 4, on symbolism in logos. It's an hour production detailing the background and symbolism of the Apple logo and the Starbucks logo. We also feature interviews with researchers Neil Kramer, Michael Tessarion, Neil Haig, Peter Taylor, Ralph Ellis, Leo Rutherford, Dan Tatman, and others. We also have some regular people on the street showing up in the program giving their take on symbolism. This is an episode we shot over in Bath and Bristol in the UK. Just click on TV on our website to watch it. It's free and available right now in HD. Today we're going to spend 2 hours with Tom Campbell and Anthony Peake, both previous guests on Red Ice Radio. We make both hours available for free. If you like what we do, please consider signing up for a membership and get full access to all of our previous programs, going back to 2006. Stay with us here for a fascinating discussion as we talk about how consciousness creates reality, the brain, God, the collective mind, strangeness and similarities between Tom's and Anthony's work. Okay, we'll say welcome to Anthony Peake first, obviously author of The Demon and The Damon, I should say, and Cheating the Ferryman. AnthonyPeake.com is his website. Good to have you back with us again, Anthony. How are you?
I'm very well and delighted to be on Red Ice Creations and Red Ice Radio again. Thank you very much for having me back so soon.
Absolutely, and of course, welcome to Tom Campbell as well. Website mybigtoe.com, author of The Big Toe, the trilogy about the theory of everything, and it wasn't that long ago since we had Tom with us, but it's really good to have you back so soon, Tom, so thank you for your time.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here.
I think this is going to be a really interesting program where we're going to talk about both of you guys' theories, of course, in terms of reality, quantum physics, consciousness, and many of the other topics that obviously dovetail with this. And basically talk about the theory of everything, what we are a part of, and how our reality is basically composed. But maybe a little bit later too, we can talk about some of the differences between the work of both of you. But I think we can ask you first, Anthony. Maybe you can tell us when you first started to look into Tom's work. Obviously, Tom has been doing this for a long time now. But when did you open up your eyes to his work, Anthony?
Well, Tom's work was on various occasions it was mentioned to me over a period of around about 5 or 6 years, and various individuals that have been attracted to my work said, you really want to read into what Tom Campbell's writing about My Big Toe. But the person that really facilitated the link was a young Slovak PhD student by the name of Martin Peniak, who came along to he emailed me initially and then came along to one of my lectures that I did down in the south of England. And he approached me and he said, genuinely, you really need to speak to Tom Campbell about his work. And there was also somebody else from my forum called Carl Lamarx, and Carl again had said that My Big Toe is really quite up your street. And then I think, Tom, I think I might have then contacted you, I guess, and we swapped books. And
yes.
It was, wasn't it? And I then received the trilogy of My Big Toe, and I think I sent you my 2 books. And,
yes, you did.
And I found My Big Toe to be one of these kind of books that you read, and as soon as you finish it, you want to reread it again, because the depth in which Tom goes to and the power of his model is simply amazing. And I was going through it, making notes here, there, and everywhere, because all I could see was synergy everywhere. Now, Tom was coming at it from a slightly different angle to myself, but we were still coming to the same conclusions. And I like to use the analogy, it's rather similar to when David Bohm was doing his work on the holographic nature of reality and the holographic nature of the universe. And he was approached by, initially I think it was Carl Pribram's son. And Carl Pribram is a psychologist that was based, probably still is, at Georgetown University. And what Carl was doing is he was doing it from the brain side outwards. So effectively, there was the cosmological quantum physics model that David Bohm was working on, and then it was Pribram coming up from a different direction. And by the meeting of the two of them, they actually realized that their overall hypothesis of theory had so much greater strength by taking it from the two angles. And I know from reading Tom's work that I very much have that feeling in terms of what Tom does. Now, the other strange irony of this is that we both use the concept of my big toe as an acronym. And this quite amazes me as to how we could have possibly come up with the two things, because big toe for me is what I call my Bohmian IMAX grand theory of everything, which we might get the opportunity to talk about later. And of course, Tom's my big toe is my big grand theory of everything. So we both have toes, and Tom and I were talking on Skype about 20 minutes ago, and I was thinking we should be able to think of some kind of acronym around the word foot, leg or something. You know? My big metatarsal, something like that.
That's really good. And if we examine or a little bit of the work that the both of you have been doing individually, so to speak, in that sense, and we can get into obviously if there's if you, Anthony, feel that there's anything missing from the theory of everything that that Tom lays forward in that sense. But Tom, maybe you can just comment quickly a little bit on Anthony's work as well. How did you approach this? Were you fascinated? Do you think, there's a little bit maybe something missing here and there, or how did you approach Anthony's work, Tom?
Well, both of us are heading in the same direction. Obviously, both of us are. Approached from different angles, but one of my favorite things to tell people is that there is but one truth, but there are many, many, many valid ways of approaching that truth. And that's really a very good thing, because some people will relate to this approach and some people will relate to a different approach. So the more approaches we have that tend to converge, then actually, the much better we all are at trying to communicate what's going on. And people who read my book then will be able to appreciate Anthony's book more and will be drawn to that, and vice versa. So I see it all as being very synergistic. We're not competing for who's got the right answer. We're all sharing our own ways of approaching that answer, and by the sharing, I think it's a much stronger story that we have to tell because of the multiple approaches. So when I looked at Anthony's, the way we differ, you brought that up. Anthony has a little more of a physical approach to it, and I have a less of one. I'm in the virtual reality camp, and Anthony's moving that way as well, but he still has more of a physical basis to the things that he's doing, such as brains and pineal glands and things like that. And though I realize the connection there, I don't put those at the center of I don't put that as the causal feature. In other words, the thing that's making it happen. I put that as an artifact of what's happening. So that's kind of a little difference, but that's almost a technical difference, which is good. We should have these differences.
Absolutely, that helps to refine the work and so forth. And obviously, if we have any new listeners with us tuning in right now, we recommend you obviously to go into the archive and listen individually to the programs, both that we've done with Tom and Anthony, if you want to hear kind of a full, more in-depth, outlay or presentation of their individual material and how they dovetail as well. Very, very interesting. But I want to get into the topic a little bit of what drives reality, how reality is created and so forth as well. I think when we both had you guys on individually, we talked quite a bit about the metaphysical aspect as well to all of this and some of the weirdness that we see out there, and try to be able to explain some of those things from this perspective. But maybe we can begin with you, Anthony, and maybe you can just give us a short little outline, if you will, of what you think drives reality, how it is created, what some of the rules maybe is in that sense, and then we can hear from Tom, and we can compare a little bit or continue from that point. But Anthony, go ahead.
Okay. From my point of view, initially, when I first started with my first book, Is There Life After Death? The Extraordinary Science of What Happens When We Die, I was coming from a very neurological point of view, because I was looking for an explanation for certain neurological phenomena such as deja vu sensations, near-death experience, these type of things. And I was very much working on the idea that these in some way were neurologically based, which I still consider they are. And I think Tom and I would both agree that we're using the term neurologically based in a very, very loose way. If we consider the brain or the physical, that the brain is some kind of a portal, as it were, between alternate realities, or gives us an opportunity to understand the reality behind the reality. But my viewpoint was trying to come to a model of what might happen to human consciousness at the point of death. And what I did was I came to the conclusion, to cut a long story short, and as you said, the 2 interviews I've done with Red Ice do actually explain this in extensive detail, 4 hours worth of it. But in general terms, what I'm saying is that at the point of death, we fall in, time slows down for us. And as Tom says in his work, time is just a construct of consciousness. Time is something that, as Tom would say, was probably brought in by his, his absolute unbounded oneness, probably, or something like this. But effectively, the idea that time is relative to consciousness and relative to perception. And what I suggest is that at the point of death, or close to death, we fall out of time. And what we do is we slip into something I call the Bohmian IMAX. And what I mean by the Bohmian IMAX is that it is a recreation, a memory recreation of your whole life from the moment of your birth to the moment of your death. Rather similar to the Matrix movies, and rather similar to a lot of things we have in modern movies, the idea of what is reality. Are we living within a waking dream? And I suggest that we are, or indeed the 75% of us who have deja vu sensations. And these individuals, when you have a deja vu, you have a memory that you've lived this time before. And this is because you're existing within this wrongly termed brain generated. I think it's the wrong way to term it. It's not necessarily brain generated, but what it's doing is it's accessing information from somewhere. Now, this again will be analogous to what Tom comes to the point of view, where our life memories are contained somewhere and the brain accesses them. Now, my latest model, because funnily enough, I've just submitted my 3rd book to my publishers, and I have a section on Tom's work on that, and this book will show how I'm moving towards Tom's point of view, is that I suggest that this information is probably being drawn up from what the mystics would call the Akashic record. I would prefer to call it the 0 point field, and using 0 point energy, particularly applying the theories and hypotheses of a Hungarian researcher called Professor Ervin Laszlo, and the idea that somewhere encoded within information, and as Laszlo calls it, information, that information is the base of everything else. As Tom would say, we live within a digital reality that could be which is a huge computer simulation. And I come to the same conclusion. But what I say is, in the final moments of life, we fall into this computer simulation and we start to relive our own lives in a form of reincarnation, which in fact is literal reincarnation. But what is really happening is we are living our own life again in a kind of a groundhog life state. And as we live this life again, when this second life comes to an end, we go back and we live it again and again. But because the information is being drawn from the Akashic record, and because if you bring in the model of Everett's many worlds interpretation, and the idea of many minds as well, is the idea that the computer simulation we are living in fact has programmed into it, as Tom would probably agree, has programmed into it all the potential futures of every decision you can possibly make. And as Tom rightly says, there are 3 databases running here. There's the present database, which is what I'm perceiving at this moment. Then there are the potentials of the future that are already encoded in, because a version of me within the Everett's many worlds interpretation, just to step back there, Everett's many worlds interpretation suggests that there are literally trillions of universes, and within those trillions of universes are trillions of us having this conversation. And each one of those trillions of us will encode a memory pattern onto the Akashic record. So what effectively it means is that all the versions of me have lived my life many, many times, and that has been recorded into this super duper first person virtual reality computer game. When I'm living the computer game within the Bohmian IMAX, every decision I make will put me along a different path within the computer game. But of course, as we know with computer games, if you go down a certain route and you end up dying or making a wrong decision, all that happens is you're taken back to the start of the game, or the game master, the being I call the Damon, which we'll come on to later, is the person that's actually playing the game, as it were, whereas we are, the Eidolon, the lower self, is the sprite on the screen. So therefore, we live with this in this computer simulation, being drawn up from the Akashic Record. In my new book as well, I actually do the model of how this may work. And what it does is, it's almost, this is why I like the David Bohm idea of enfoldment. And the idea is, we're creating our universe, as Tom again says, and Tom and I both agree, this is the universe we are existing in, and both the consensual reality we live within as well, what Tom would call as physical matter reality, is still a creation of consciousness in one way or another. Mm-hmm. And what we're doing is we're modeling it all the time, and we are encoding it, and we're living within it. And I believe this is exactly what David Bohm said when he had something called enfoldment. And it's like the concept of a holographic image, that each part of a holographic image contains the whole. Mm. And it's the same with these records. It's things enfolded into themselves. I always think of the wonderful line by William Blake, to see heaven in a wild flower. And I suggest that the whole universe can be found in your teardrops. Mm. And within that universe will be you. So it enfolds within itself. And this, I would think, is what the absolute unbounded manifold that Tom talks about.
Well, I'd like to ask Tom here then at that point how, I think we touched upon a little bit of this as well last time we had you with us, Tom, but how physical and obviously if there's any points here that you want to argue about in terms of what Anthony has presented, please go ahead, but also the computer simulation, Anthony alludes to that this is basically then it's being run by the daemon in that sense. It has an administrator, but how physical do you see this? Is this a server in that sense standing somewhere, even if that is on a dimension, if you will, that we cannot see right now or have access to in that sense, but is it a computer, or how do you view that, Tom?
Okay, well, you ask a question, how physical is it? You have to understand that physical is a point of view. Physical is not something that is an objective thing that stands alone. In other words, when you are in this reality, in this virtual, digital, information-based reality, this reality seems physical because this is you're getting data within the rule set of this reality frame. Now, when you're dreaming, you're not in this reality frame anymore. Now you're in a dream frame, and that seems physical. And when you're out of body and you're experiencing things, those things seem physical. In other words, physical is defined by the perceiver, by the viewer, if you will. So where you are and where what databases, what data stream you're connected to, you see as physical. It's there. You touch it, you smell it, you feel it, you have certain, rule sets you have to abide by. And everything else seems non-physical. So there really is no such thing as physical or non-physical. They're just a point of view. Reality is reality. It's all information. And to say, well, this one is the physical one, well, that's just because our point of view is here. We're engaged in this particular data stream, so this seems physical. So there really is no such thing as physical. There's really no such thing as non-physical. It's all just a big informational field, and there are different data streams, different aspects of it, and so there is no big physical computer someplace on another planet or in another dimension that's doing this, and
right.
Those beings are playing this video game. It's all one thing, and that's consciousness. Consciousness is that digital information field. So in that sense, you can't answer that question because physical really is just a perspective of the viewer.
That's right.
And so that's that answer. As far as the things that Tony was talking about, well, we have to describe these things with our language, and basically language is symbol and metaphor. And Tony and I use different metaphors. He will call a daemon, and in my terminology, you see that's something else. So it's there's always a problem in communication in that we use different metaphors. And there's a few places, though, where there's some significant difference. But it's not a difference, if you will, so much on the main line of where we're going. Because, yes, I agree, this is the virtual reality. And, yes, there are these informational fields. There's these databases. And, yes, one of these databases is what I call the probable future reality, which lays out the probability of every possibility. The probability of everything that that could happen. And yes, we make choices, and as we make choices, we thread our way through that possibility. You see, this is all sounding very much like what Tony said. And then we live in the present, and then all of this probability distribution of all the choices of all the players that are interactive in this game called our universe. They, as soon as the present moment's over, all those possible choices now become part of the historical database, which is all the things that we did, which is what I call our history thread, and all the things we could have done but didn't. That's what I call the non-actualized history. But actually, we're making 3 databases here, but they're all just one big database. And the probable future, as the time clicks on, and time, yes, is it's a local process. That every reality frame has its own time. The dream reality frame doesn't run on, the same clock that this physical matter runs on. All reality frames have their own clock. They're all virtual realities. So, so we have this database then that starts with all the probabilities of all the possibilities, and as the present moment is where we have free will, we make the choices, and then out the other side we have the database that's everything that did happen and everything that could have happened. Now, these databases then make up what the Hindus many, many years ago called the Akashic Records. And that's all the information. So one of the places that Tony and I would maybe have a disagreement, again, it's not fundamental, it's just in the metaphors we use, is he talks about many worlds, many minds, and that all of these worlds are operating independently, and all of it exists. I don't necessarily do that in the same sense that Tony described it. What I will say is that you have this database, and okay, we have the many possible worlds, if you will, but they're not all independent worlds progressing. All the actors are in there interacting. All they are is probabilities of what the possibilities are, what could happen next, what are all the choices we can make in the next delta t, which is like the cycle time of the simulation. So we have that, and then we have this historical database. So it's not that there are, you'd almost end up with an infinite number. You see, you end up with this number that's so big, because every time an electron, changes, its spin, then you have to end up with a different reality frame, because now that's something different. Every difference then creates another reality. That, to me, gets unwieldy. It's too much. It is unnecessary. So all the action by the players, us, individuated units of consciousness, is going on in the present. Yet we have this projected of all the possibilities and the probabilities that we will make, various choices. And then in the history database, all those probabilities are still there. So you can go into this history database and you can do what-if analysis. You can say, well, okay, here we are, and it's 1943 or 44, and what if, Adolf Hitler won World War II? What would it be like now in 2010? And you can go back and run through those. And it's not that you're jumping from one reality frame to the next, as it is as you're going through this database according to the probabilities. So you have this you have all these probabilities, and they're all relative to each other. You say, well, if this didn't happen, then what would be most probable that did happen, or what could happen? And if this didn't happen that way, so you can do all those. And these databases are wonderful. They're not like the libraries that we're used to. They're very linear. In this database, you have all the possibilities. So you can take all of the things that could have happened in any which way, and you can play those, and it's like being there. It's like you're in the movie, okay, because that's the level of detail captured by the database. So your intent programs where it is you want to go. If you want to say, all right, if this changed, then show me all the most likely things that would have happened after that. So then basically the program runs you through all the largest probabilities that derive from that thing happening. So you can run through it. And if you get in there and wander around and don't really know what you're doing or how it works, then you can easily get confused because there's all these reality frames, and people wander in them sometimes when they're doing out of body, and sometimes when they're meditating, and they'll get pieces of data, and sometimes the data fits. They can go look it up and it's perfect, and sometimes it just doesn't make any sense. Well, that's because they're not necessarily on our history thread anymore. They're in something else. And if you're not able to control your intent and your focus very carefully, then you can kind of wander around and it becomes confusing. So so there are these little differences, but you see, Anthony and I end up basically at the same place anyway, even though we have some different ideas of the details of how we got there, and we have a lot of different metaphors. So my model is a little simpler and doesn't require, these huge numbers of parallel realities all chugging along with all the little people in them chugging along. The only people in my scheme that have free will are the people in the present. That's where all the decisions are. There are really no people in these future probability or in the historical. They're just data. They're not actors. And that's one of the things that once you learn to get around in these records, I once thought the other way too, that I thought that they were different realities that were still all interacting with free will, but that wasn't the case. And you can test that by going into these historic databases, asking your questions, and pretty soon it seems kind of stilted. It's not quite as colorful as it was, and you realize that the reason is that you don't have a lot of randomness going on there. You really are walking through a database. It's kind of buttoned down, and you don't get all of the reactions and interactions that you would expect. It's almost like a reality that seems as real as this one, except it's a little flat. It's just a little stilted, and that's because you're working through a database with probabilities rather than a real live bunch of people executing free will. Now that simplifies now the model a whole lot, and you get all the same results without all the complication. So I guess that's why I go there. Being a physicist, I'm into Occam's razor and taking the simplest explanation that gives you the right answer.
Right.
So that's a little bit Tony talked for a long while, and I can't remember all of the details he said. As we were going on, I was thinking, oh yeah, there's something I could comment, but by now most of that is lost. But all in all, Tony and I are on the same sheet of music. We just differ some by the detail.
That's right. Let's see if we can bring some of these points up again, of course. But I think it's fascinating with this idea of the access to these historical databases as well, and how we get into those what if kind of scenarios, and how we plot that in one sense. And obviously, some people will figure, as you mentioned, Tom, that people can access this through meditation. I personally think about, obviously that's how remote viewing works. For instance,
sure.
Out-of-body experiences, other kinds of ways to kind of tap into the different lines of probability here in that sense. And Anthony, you obviously began looking at this from the point of view of life after death, and also obviously highlighting the deja vu experiences, kind of, if I put it this way, normal weirdness that can happen to basically everybody in life, although they might be into remote viewing or meditation in that sense. But what's your take on that, Anthony? How would you say that we can access some of these different what-if scenarios? And also, are you agreeing that with Tom that it's not all playing out at the same time, but it's just information out there, and it's depending on our choice that drives the main timeline, Anthony?
Yeah, I'd very much agree with Tom in the sense that it's information-driven, and that effectively when it comes down to it, binary notation, it's as simple as that. It's digital, and I think that the more we research into the nature of reality, the more it seems to be digitally processed. For instance, the idea that time itself, people have been talking recently about the idea of something called a chronon, which is a particle of time. And again, I was intrigued when Tom did his interview with you, when he was talking about the Planck time, the 10 to minus 44 seconds, the idea this is the smallest possible bit of time. and of course the Planck length being the smallest part of reality. And of course the implication is that these things are quantized. So effectively we perceive them being a continuum, but the reality is that they're not. They're quantized. They're sort of bits of information that are related to each other. Now, one of the things that, again, I was fascinated on Tom's comments there is about, and it's a wonderful analogy there, and it's very true, and I deal with this in my books, and particularly my latest book, where I deal with lucid dreaming and out-of-the-body experiences and distance viewing. And Tom's quite right. You know, when you are in an alternate state, the idea to consider this reality to be the reality, in other words, implies that there's a kind of base reality that is really solid and real. But of course, if you talk to psychologists and you talk to psychiatrists, effectively one of the biggest mysteries of conscious experience is something called qualia. You know, the way we internally generate the reality around us in the way we do. For instance, one of the things that's long surprised me is how the visual system works, whereby we can generate over a small postage stamped image that's inverted and placed on the back of the eye. The brain can create this three-dimensional multicolored reality that encompasses everything in our visual field. And it's clearly because the brain or something inside is modeling that reality and presenting it to consciousness. And consciousness, in fact, as you're probably aware, you know, effectively we process information and there's a delay, there's a buffering going on before conscious experience is presented to whatever the little homunculus is in the head. So therefore, there has to be some kind of recording process going on here. So I totally agree with Tom on that. Also, going back to your very first point about my Eidolon and Damon concept, I also have a concept, and I've been discussing this with a group of associates I've got called the Walker Group, and we meet regularly in Liverpool, our local city here. And we've been debating this for some time, and revisiting some of Tom's writings over the last few weeks. You know, we've come up with a concept called the Uber Damon. And the Uber Damon sounds so similar to Tom's larger consciousness system. The idea that there is a kind of there is a consciousness that is experiencing reality through us. And I use the analogy, it's rather like consciousness, or the larger consciousness system, is using us almost like characters in this ongoing soap opera, whereby it's experiencing itself or experiencing life and everything else through what we do. And as Tom very much makes the very strong point, we have free will within this as well, so that each part of the program, as it were, manifests its free will throughout the program. So in many ways, Tom and I are coming from different directions, and I readily admit that I'm still fairly rooted in the scientific method of you know, analysing things. I wouldn't say that I'm a reductionist, in the sense I do realise that there are certain things that science can never explain. It's something David Chalmers calls the hard problem, and the idea that we'll never really explain where consciousness comes from, because you can look at the neuronal systems of the brain, you can look at the neurotransmitters of the brain, but it still won't get you anywhere near a consciousness. So consciousness is something that's possibly out there. It's probably a field of some description. Who knows? But effectively, the digital model to me is the most beguiling. You know, I adore the work of people like Nick Bostrom, and the idea that we're in that this is a simulation we are living within. And that is so beguiling. And as we move on, as we understand more about cybernetics, as we understand more about the nature of information, the more that becomes clearly the way to go forward.
Right.
You know, and again, as Tom would say, you know, 110 years ago, science thought they knew everything. You know, the famous quotation that, you know, we know everything, we really need to fine-tune things to the next fourth decimal point, and we'll have a grand theory of everything. And then, you know, we had black body radiation that didn't quite fit. We had the photoelectric effect that didn't quite affect. And then Einstein came along with his revolutionary new looking at information. And remember, he didn't do it through experimentation. He did it by sitting back and thinking about what it would be like to travel on a light wave. You know, so clearly the paradigm we live within seems to answer 95% of the questions. But the black swans are the things that interest people like Tom and I. And it's the black swans, the things that don't fit, are the clues to the next paradigm we're going to create. And again, as Tom has said, if you are within a system, and we are within this consciousness system, we are within the program, we can't understand what's outside of the program because we're not outside of the program. But what we can do is come up with some kind of a model of understanding of what consciousness really is. And of course, everybody listening out there, the one thing you know with absolute certitude is that you are a consciously aware being. That's the only thing you actually know. And it's the only thing we know empirically to be the case. Because, of course, if you look at the word empirical, back to its Latin roots, it actually means experience.
That's right.
And experience. So all we can absolutely know, I'm not saying I'm a Cartesian, but the argument is Descartes was quite right. The only thing you actually really know with any certitude is that you think, therefore you am, or you think, therefore you are.
Yeah, right.
But clearly somebody else could be thinking for you.
So this whole idea as well of obviously some people, from a theological point of view would put the name God instead of an Uber Damon, Anthony, in that sense. And obviously I think many people are describing the same thing there. But what's your take on that, Tom, in terms of somebody or whatever it now is living in that sense through us, creating experiences? I mean, when you were with us last time, we talked about, I think, the level of coherency in terms of information exchange, if you will, in that sense. And you talked about love obviously being an essential, if not the most important, level of coherent exchange in that sense to this as well. And I can't help to wonder about some of the negative things that we have happening in our world as well. And if that is another experience, if you will, that this consciousness is having, and therefore we are a part of that and experiencing those things. But what's your take on this, Tom?
Well, you have to, we have to answer the question of, given that there is this, if we think of it as a being, that already creates a problem. But let's just start there and try to work our way out of the hole. If you think of this Uber Damon or the larger consciousness system as an individual, and we are existing as thoughts in its mind and that kind of stuff, then you have to answer the question, why would it want to do that?
Yeah.
If you have this big being there and it has all of this capacity and ability and obviously brilliance beyond our comprehension, why is it playing this rather, I don't know what we call it, a game that we find as our reality? In other words, what's the point?
Yeah.
Why would it do that? It would be doing things certainly more interesting and intelligent than that. So you have to see the whole thing as a system. And when you do, you realize there are, it's not that this is the Uber being. Now, it's the Uber Damon perhaps, because that's a more general idea than the being. But I call it just the larger consciousness system. And the larger consciousness system is just a self-aware data field. And we get to the point of, well, where did that come from? And like Tony was saying, you're outside of the box there beyond what you can see. So we just can't answer that question. We can't know everything, because if you are consciousness, you have to be something else to get outside of consciousness. And we're not something else. We can't get outside of the system that we are a part of, or that, where we exist within that system. So anyway, we don't know those answers to those questions of where did that come from. We just have to say, well, don't know. But we can model what it is we do know. And my take on that is that you have this system. It evolved. It didn't just happen, because then it's a problem. Well, who made that big thing? Who made the Uber being?
That's right.
So it just evolved. It was an aware potential that could differentiate states, and eventually it grew into the larger consciousness system, like everything else does, by evolution. Now, evolution has to have a purpose. Things don't just evolve in every direction randomly. They evolve because of constraints that they have on it, and it has a purpose. It's an information field. All information fields can be looked at in terms of signal and noise, if you will. Information and non-information. Noise is just random bits and carries nothing, means nothing. Information, being able to differentiate one state from another, say, requires a lowering of the entropy. Entropy is a measure of disorder. So this thing, to evolve, had to lower its entropy. And how does one lower its entropy? Well, it starts out kind of like any other basic evolution. It tries things and sees how it works. Random things happen, and if they help you decrease entropy, then you try to do more of those. And the ones that go the opposite direction, you don't. So it evolves. And in the process of this evolution, being one monolithic thing is very limiting. So what it does is it breaks itself up into a large number of things that can interact with each other rather than just one thing sitting in its armchair contemplating by itself. Now there's lots of things that are interacting. Suddenly if you just look at this as information theory, suddenly what the scientists would call novelty of the system goes up dramatically because you have all these things interacting, and they have to interact with free will. In other words, they have to make whatever, do any interactions that they do based on their own set of decisions for their own reasons. Otherwise, there's no value to it if it's scripted. So, in any case, the system is the whole thing. We talk about we're all one. It's all one big thing, and we're a part of the one. Well, that's literally true, not just figuratively true. It's this one larger consciousness system, and we kind of bubble up out of the system, if you will. And as we are interesting, as productive, that we help the system evolve by having experience through our interaction, then we are lowering the entropy of the system as we lower our own entropy. As we grow up, evolve, become love, love is correlated with lowering entropy. Love is defined as the expression of a low entropy consciousness. That defines love. So I see it, I kind of pull it all together in the sense that, yes, we are, you can make this analogy. The techies will like it. The non-techies will think it's horrible. But, you know about refrigeration cycles where you have a fluid that just keeps going round and round and round in a closed cycle, and you have a compressor, and it compresses the fluid, and then it pushes that compressed fluid through a little hole and it expands. Well, on one side of the hole where the pressure is, it's hot. On the other side where it expands, it's cool. And you can make that, that's how heat pumps work. And you can make that a heater, or you can make it a refrigerator, depending on which side of that orifice you want to stick your heat exchanger on. So then the fluid goes through the hole, which expands it gets cool and goes back to the pump. The pump pumps it, gives it pressure, and it just keeps going round and round and round. So that's a closed cycle system that heats or refrigerates. Now, we're sort of like that. We're part of a system, and we go round and round and round through these experience packets, or lifetimes, if you will, and each time we lower our entropy a little bit, or at least that's our goal, and as we do, the whole system lowers its entropy. So in that view is we are, we're like the refrigerant, we are the working fluid, the working substance of the larger system of consciousness. We are it, and it is us. And we exist, basically, bubbled up out of this larger system to play these roles in these virtual realities. And our universe is not the only virtual reality. There are other virtual realities. I come from a little different direction, though I'm a physicist, I'm a scientist, but I come from a kind of a twofold direction. One, I learned early on with Bob Monroe about out of body and talking with non-physical entities, exploring the larger reality, visiting other reality frames. So I had all of that on one side. So when Tony talks about that you survive death and what happens there, well, I've hundreds of times I've watched that. I've been a part of it. You can go to where people are dying and you can watch the transition. You can help with the transition. So all of that is just a part of my experience. So it's not something that needs to be proven, I guess, to me. It's just as much a part of my experience as sitting here talking with you on the radio. Yeah. So, and I'm aware of all these other reality frames, and I've been to many of them, and so I've got that side. On the other side, I'm a physicist, and I approach everything with logic and with rationality. It all has to make sense. So it's these two part of me's that would seem to be kind of diametrically opposed, but they're not. They all actually come to the same conclusions in the same way. So we see that science actually predicts or explains this, the out of body, the life after death. All these things are seen as rational if you have this bigger picture of the way it works. So yes, I do see this larger consciousness system, but it's not a being. It's not the being pulling the strings and we're the pet people, all right? And it's playing us because we amuse it, we add humor, to its existence. That's not what's going on. We're here and we have to interact. We have free will and we sink or swim by our own choices. And if we make good choices, we move toward love. The whole system, moves forward with that because we're lowering the entry of the system because we're part of it. And as we make bad choices and move toward fear, then we're moving the system the other way. It doesn't work. But you have to have the free will, otherwise it doesn't work. You can't. You have to have free will in order to have consciousness, and you have to have consciousness in order to have free will. Those two are logically necessary for the existence of the other. That's just the way that works. So I see it as all one big coherent picture. So the reason why would this larger conscious system want to dream us up and run these scenarios? Well, because we're part of the working fluid that drives its own evolution. This working system is still evolving. It's not a done deal. You see, it's not just sitting there done and now it's playing with its pet people. It's evolving as well. And we're part of that evolutionary process.
And that again comes back, doesn't it, Tom, to the whole idea of David Bohm and holism and everything else, and the idea of the holographic nature of reality, reality using it in the term we prefer to use it as digital reality, and the sense that, we are part of the greater whole. Now, in terms of philosophy and such like, the term is panpsychism, and the idea that life is a unity in one way or another. But what this is even greater than panpsychism, because what it's saying is that everything that is perceived, everything that is out there, is part of a something which is a digital reality. And indeed, one of the major problems of people who are just deists have the major problem of the concept of the nature of evil. Now, I think Tom's model of the idea of moving to lower states of entropy is absolutely a perfect analogy, and his concept of love, I think, works very, very powerfully, because this does explain and gets over the problem of what's called theodicy and the idea of why does evil exist? Why does evil happen? Well, evil is just part and parcel of the way things are. In other words, whatever is my Uber Damon, for want of a better term, is not responsible in that way for everything that's around. It's part of it in exactly the same way as everything else is. It's almost trying to look at a worldview that is subtly different. We're all part of everything, and everything's part of us. And I think this holism concept is the way things tend to be going within science as well.
Yes, if you didn't have evil, or the possibility of evil, then you couldn't have free will.
Correct.
You see, people have free will. They have to be able to make bad decisions as well as good decisions. Otherwise, it's not free will. If you say, well, here it is, and you all have free will, but you can decide anything you want as long as you decide what I want. That's not free will. And
make us automatons, wouldn't it? It would make us literally like sprites in a computer game that is dependent on the movement. But in order to have the magic of life, you have to make mistakes, you have to make errors. And of course, that's one of the models I use in my first book. And in one of the introductory passages, I turn around and I say, we learn by our mistakes. And that's one of the arguments I've used for why my model, I think, works logically, is that if you are reincarnated as somebody else in the old reincarnation model, effectively your memories are wiped clean, you don't know who you are, you're reincarnated as somebody else, and you start from baseline one again. Whereas if you live your life again as yourself, with a part of you, your daemon, knowing the errors you made last time round, you have the opportunity for improvement, and you can move on and you can evolve as part and parcel of the greater whole. So we have this kind of logical synergy there, whereby, it makes logical sense and it makes moral sense for that kind of scenario. And we're all moving to what Tom calls love. The idea that a system which has got low entropy is, I always get the entropies the wrong way around, so forgive me if I've done that, but the idea that everybody's working together, the system is working together, and it's moving away from chaos towards order. And maybe that's what, the universe started with a big bang. And since then, it's supposed to be moving downwards and cooling down. But the reality could be that there's this alternate channels that's running the other way, where life itself is running towards trying to get everything right and working in the correct way.
I'm fascinated by this idea as well that you mentioned, Tom, that the system has kind of decentralized, again, for the lack of a better term, itself. It's compartmentalized itself because it's for one, it's a better way of doing things. It becomes less maybe vulnerable even, and it's a more coherent way that it can do more things at the same time, simultaneously in that sense, I guess. But
it's a parallel processing. Instead of having one monolithic thing that can interact with itself, you parallel process. Now you have, lots and lots of things who all have the ability to lower their entropy. That's a much better, to parallel process that function is a much better job. What kind of experience do you have, with yourself? Well, you can think about things, but you're very limited. It's that interaction that challenges you.
That's right. And the question as well on top of that is, if our consciousness drives reality, if that is more or less powerful. I'm thinking, I guess, in one sense of the collective consciousness here as well, the mass consciousness, because in one regard I can see that it is the whole that is creating the world that we're living in, so forth as well, or if is this overarching consciousness of the larger consciousness system that you mentioned, Tom, that actually is overseeing this process, because in one sense, and we alluded to this last time we had you on as well, that there is forces and people who have a stronger free will, for instance, than other people, individual stronger will that have kind of overrun other people's free will in that sense. And if something would influence the mass consciousness too much, do you think that there's something, this larger consciousness system would kind of come back into the picture and knock it back into the right direction again, so to speak? Or how do you view that, Tom?
Part of the problem comes as we view these various pieces. These pieces are metaphors. When we talk about that larger consciousness system and kind of the overseer and that kind of stuff, suddenly in our mind, an overseer is a individual different than us. It's something, in our reality, because of our rule set, we kind of make everything is different. It all exists in its own space, and it all is its unique individuality. We really are all one thing. So think of this as just a big data field, okay? And we're a part of that data field. And then we don't have so much of these groupings other than we need them as metaphors to help ourselves talk about them. So we have things like, higher selves. This is like Anthony's Damon. We have higher selves, oversouls. We have all these different metaphors that talk about kind of the larger us of consciousness, and we're kind of the smaller us as consciousness. And all these things are, though, just metaphors.
Right.
Okay? So they're ways for us to dice things up, to make pigeonholes, to make categories and give them names so that we can talk about them. But don't get carried away and think that because we broke it up into these pieces, that these pieces sit there and, exist as separate chunks that are kind of disconnected from us.
Right.
We're all connected to this. We're all connected together. It's all one information field. Now, yes, there is a thing called group consciousness, and basically it's just the vector sum of all the individual pieces of that consciousness. And yes, they have a larger system that has this virtual reality of ours. It's a learning lab. It's a trainer, like flight trainers that the pilots train in. This is a trainer, and we're here to lower our entropy, to grow up, to become love, spiritual growth, however you want to call that. And because of that, the system doesn't just create the situation and then totally ignore it and let it go. The system doesn't interfere with it. We get to make good or bad choices, and nothing changes that. But the system can how do you say it? Manipulate's not the right word, but it can nudge us in various directions to make this virtual reality trainer a more effective trainer. But it has to do this within the rules, if you will. It can't be a heavy-handed sort of thing. It has to be an individual kind of thing. So it's not that this administrator, if you will, sees, though that's not good. Look at that. There's about to be a war there. I guess I'll put an end to that, and suddenly all the nukes go limp, and all the triggering mechanisms don't work. It's not that sort of thing.
Sure.
We're not being manipulated by a being who is watching us and turning the dials and pulling the strings. It doesn't work that way. We just are as we are, and we do what we do. But individually, we can be nudged this way and that. We can have these deja vu moments that show us something. We can have dreams that give us understanding. We can get this little voice in our head that tells us, something. It's called intuition, right? All of these ways are basically connections, ports, if you will, communication ports that we have with the larger system. So it's not that the larger system backs out and has no interaction, but it does let us do what we do, for better or for worse, because otherwise it can't work. You can't have consciousness without the free will. Then it just becomes, a program play that everybody's going through the motions. And if you analyze that logically, it doesn't make any sense. There's no value in it. There's no point. That would not happen because it has no value. Things with no value and no ability to produce don't evolve. Randomness doesn't evolve. It's randomness.
Anthony, let's get your comment on that, or if there's anything else you're thinking about, and then we can begin to round things up with the first hour. But go ahead, Anthony, if there's anything you want to add to that, or have a different view on maybe.
Yeah, no, it's very much a model that is similar to my own. Again, we have slight differences in what we define the levels of the guidance in terms of what is happening here. But I think I very much go with the holism idea. But I would suggest that within my model, within my big toe, within my Bohmian IMAX grand theory of everything, what I'm suggesting is that we're living in this three-dimensional recreation of our lives that's drawing up information from the Akashic record or from wherever. But what is happening is that as we live this, our daemon, because it has lived the life before, is aware of the mistakes we made last time round, for want of a better term. And therefore, when we talk about intuition and we talk about guidance and we talk about precognitions and dream precognitions, I would argue that's because, and it's probably far more prosaic, I would argue that that's because there is a part of you that remembers the events that took place last time round and is subtly trying to move you to another route, another part of the computer game that you didn't take last time round because you made some traumatic mistake in one way or another. However, there is then the argument of the collective conscious, the collective unconscious that sits above that, the Uber Damon, or what Tom would consider to be the absolute unbounded oneness, the whatever it is that's experiencing through us, as it were. And I think that makes sense as well, that there is something behind it all as well. And what I particularly like about Tom's model is one of the major problems I've had throughout my career of writing is when people ask me, well, what's it all for? It's the teleological argument, the idea of, well, there must be a reason for everything. Tom's model very much gives the reason for everything, because all we're doing is we're trying to equalize the system. And that makes sense to me. So it gives it a reason without necessarily introducing the concept of an all-seeing, all-personal God figure that actually has a plan for everything. It's a far more beguiling and interesting concept, and the idea that, yes, there is a plan, but it's no different to a plan to the way in which we have evolved throughout the centuries via DNA and via Darwinian selection, or whatever particular ideas you believe. So that makes sense to me, and it does make sense to me, and it works very well as a model.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I agree with Tony. We do accumulate this knowledge. It's in a digital information system. Information is not lost. We do accumulate this knowledge. We do get, otherwise, this starting over wouldn't be nearly so effective if you couldn't learn. If it wasn't, if you didn't get wiser as time went on, it wouldn't be nearly as effective. So, of course, we do learn, and we are more than just this what I call little c consciousness, which is our awareness here. There is a larger component of us, and that component is well aware of why we're there and what we're supposed to be doing, and what we need to do next, and that's part of our connection back into this larger system. But again, all these things are metaphors. It's all part of a larger system in the process of evolving itself. And why does it evolve itself? Well, it's either evolve or die. If you're a system, you either deteriorate or you grow. And so it's just a natural thing for a self-modifying, aware system to lower its entropy, to grow, to evolve. It changes. And we're just a part of that process, and in that process, we continually grow from life experience to life experience. It's cumulative. Otherwise, you would never get anywhere if it wasn't cumulative. You'd be kind of stuck. You'd not be able to progress. Just like our evolution is cumulative. We started with one-celled things, many-celled things, and they differentiated, and then we got things swimming in the sea, and then they walked out because there was more food outside than inside, and so on. So it keeps going. It adapts. It evolves just because it does, because it can. You don't have to have a prescribed reason why something evolves. Change happens. As long as you have a dynamic system with a clock, then things will change. Decisions are made, and the result of that change is either evolution or de-evolution. You can't stay the same. The system's too big and complicated for being a static system.
And the interesting question there, of course, as well, is how we, as conscious beings, as part of this, obviously move towards love as well. And I think that's why it's interesting to contemplate the ideas of how consciousness is creating reality, because if that is the case, then how do we change reality with our consciousness in that sense to be able to move towards this path of being, more empathic and having a better way of life, basically, in that sense, and give feedback to the system in one sense.
Yeah. Well, we are in this reality trainer that we're in is not just like a flight trainer, which is a deterministic program. In this trainer, we get to create our reality to a large extent. Now, we don't create everything. We're beholden to a rule set. We can't just do whatever we want, but we can modify those future probabilities with our intent, and we can exercise our free will. So we have to interpret in a reality that's comprised of data. What you interpret as your reality, what you think your reality is, what's real for you is your interpretation of the data you get. And how you interpret that has a lot to do with who you are, what your experience has been, and what you've made of it, how much entropy you have in your system. So we do, in many ways, create this reality, and it's part of the feedback. So if we are very fearful beings, we tend to create a very fearful reality. It's just we make this. So when you look at this reality and you read the papers and watch the news and you get depressed because, all it is about people hurting other people and people grabbing and trying to take advantage of each other and so on and so on. And you kind of want to say, oh, geez, where are we going? This doesn't seem to be working. Well, what you see is what we are. That's the expression. That's the expression of what we collectively have produced here, because we create this reality.
Yeah,
exactly, Tom. And as we would both agree, you go back to the particle physics and you go back to the Copenhagen interpretation and the idea that the act of observation collapses the wave function of a particle, or it turns a wave function into a particle. And one of the things that I found very amusing, and I don't know whether you necessarily mention it in your books, but in one of your papers that you did when you were describing how the car keys, if you put your car keys down and you look back and they're not there, and it's because only one person has collapsed the wave function of those particular car keys. Now, you turn around to people who are not necessarily thinking deeply about the implications of science and what the discoveries of science over the last 120 years have been, is that's exactly what does take place. The act of observation brings about the reality around us. So therefore, collectively, we are responsible collectively for the state of the reality around us. There's no escaping that.
Yeah.
And we, the three of us now are creating our reality. And as Tom would agree with me, the moment I look away from the screen, and whatever's being behind me is not being rendered behind my head, because there's no need for that to be rendered, because it's not in my consciousness field. If I turn round, it is rendered, just like a computer game is rendered. You know, when you wander around in these beautiful scenarios, the computer doesn't render the stuff behind you because it doesn't need to. And that's the same with reality.
So Anthony, what you're saying is seeing it is rendering it. So, for instance, if I turn my eyes away from my chair or computer screen, since I no longer see it, it actually it is there in one sense, but it's not being rendered by my brain in that sense, right?
As I would suggest, is what is happening is that it's gone back to being a wave function rather than a point of reality, for want of a better term,
right?
Because it just becomes a wave function again. But there is an argument to say once a wave function has been collapsed, it remains collapsed. Tom, what's your opinions on that? I'd be interested to know your point of view on that one.
Yeah, well, the way it works is that we do not live in an objective reality. Okay, we live in a probabilistic, statistical reality that approximates objectivity under certain conditions. And if you will, this is the next step up in I probably shouldn't say in relativity, but it's the next step up in understanding. You see, every time we get a major paradigm shift, what happens is that we look back at it and say, oh, now I see a bigger picture. But the bigger picture contains the old picture that I used to think was the biggest picture. And that old picture is really just an approximation. See, Newtonian physics was like that. We finally get to quantum mechanics and relativistic physics, and we look back at Newtonian physics and say, oh, well, within its own area where it applies, it's still good. But now we see that as a subset. It's just an approximation to the bigger thing, and it's a subset. Well, you get the same thing when you take the next bigger step, and that is we do not live in an objective reality. That objective reality is just an approximation within certain conditions. And those conditions have to do with the way our rule set has defined this virtual reality. So no, reality is not deterministic. It's not objective. And of course that brings up some big questions. Well, if reality is not objective, then what about the this wonderful crown jewel of scientists, which is called the scientific method? The scientific method requires an objective reality. Otherwise, that scientific method doesn't work. Well, the fact is that scientific method is limited to only dealing with certain things. You get outside of that realm, and scientific method doesn't work because the reality is bigger than that. It's only a part of it. So that gets us back to the overall. I guess I'm kind of wandered here, but that gets us back to this idea of does the monitor you're looking at disappear or whatever. Well, once you bring something into this reality with your measurement, then it has to stay here according to the rule set. The rule set doesn't have things disappearing and not disappearing. So when you turn back around, your monitor's still going to be there because that's the most probable thing to find there because you already know that that's there. You bought the monitor, you brought it home, you set it on your desk. Now the probability that when you come back to this room a few minutes later that monitor is going to be there is extremely high, but it's all just probability. But that probability is so high that it approximates a objective reality. So we say, oh, well, that monitor is objective. It sits there. It has its own reality. That's not so. It's a probabilistic reality, and it's just probable under our rule set for that reality, for that monitor to still be there when you come back in the room. And because that probability is so high, then it approximates an objective reality. So that's the way the world basically works. Well, a question was popping up there, so go ahead and jump in.
One of the things that intrigues me at the moment is some of the work. There's one or two people on my forum that are researchers in the latest areas of quantum physics in terms of quantum computing. And of course, quantum computing works upon exactly that principle. The idea that electrons have a probability of being found in a particular location, but effectively there is the chance that sometimes a particle might be found outside of where it should be located. And They're working on the idea of developing computers along this line. And of course,
we've been using that concept for decades and decades. There are things called tunneling diodes, which are part of our electronic components that are sold in stores all over, and the way this works.
And they tunnel in exactly the same principle, yeah?
Yeah, it's exactly the same thing. The whole concept of tunneling, which is something we use to, build that monitor that you're talking about, probably has some diodes, tunneling effects going on. So we use those kinds of things. And what it is that a electron doesn't exist as a particle. Nothing really exists as matter. There is no matter. It's all data. It's all probabilistic. And because you have things that are very small that we can't see, that we can't touch, then there's a lot of uncertainty where they are. And if there's uncertainty, then there's a probability that they might be here and a probability they might be there. And because of the way we constrain them, say with fields or wires or other things, then the probability that they're here may be very high. But the probability that they're someplace else, though small, maybe 10 to the minus 10th, you see, it still exists. And for particles where there are 10 to the 50th, then, these electrons, you have so many bouncing around, then that 10 to the minus 10th probability suddenly starts generating some results because you're down in this world of minute things in large quantities, and you start seeing some of these things where they're not supposed to be. That's called tunneling. And everything is that way. The whole reality basically works that way. And quantum mechanics kind of tells us that. It tells us, when you look at quantum mechanics and don't try to explain away the facts that you see, quantum mechanics tells you that reality is not objective, that it's probabilistic. And it's that way through and through. It's not just that way for little tiny things. It's the whole reality works the same way. And with a good approximation, because of our rule set, we can treat it as an objective reality, just like with a good approximation. As long as you stay with large things at slow speeds, Newtonian physics is a good approximation. The larger reality is not objective. So the idea, that's one of the problems I have with breaking our reality up into a gazillion little separate realities that are just like this one, and they're all physical, and all the little people are making all the possible things in them. That's unnecessary. I mean, that's certainly a logical possibility, but it's a possibility that's unnecessarily complicated. So it's just probability. All those databases just run on probability. Our whole reality here runs on probability. And yes, you make a measurement and you create something. You get something from that measurement, and then that has to stay here according to the rule set. And it's very probable that it's going to be there because that's the way the rule set is. The rule set says that things don't appear and disappear. Our physics doesn't allow that. But that doesn't mean that the probability that it's going to disappear is zero. It's just very, very small. And you take something like the car keys that Anthony mentioned, and how that works is that if there is a lot of uncertainty as to where those car keys are, then the probability that they may be someplace else other than where you think you left them, it starts to get high enough that they're just likely to be someplace else than where you left them, because now you're dealing with uncertainty. That's big enough. If you're dealing with the uncertainty of whether or not your monitor is still going to be there, that uncertainty is minute. If you have car keys that you remember that you left them in your bedroom, but that was 3 days ago, but you kind of remember that, and then you find them someplace else, well, it doesn't mean that you just had a bad memory. It could be that there was enough uncertainty in the system as to where those things were that when you did make a measurement, you found them someplace else. So see, we live in kind of a squirrely world, and a lot of these things that happen that way, we can chalk up to it's just bad memory or this or that. Well, that's basically a reflection of the amount of uncertainty involved. If there wasn't that much uncertainty involved, then it couldn't happen.
Which again shows that idea that it's consciousness driving the whole experience and making things happen. Yes. But Anthony, go ahead.
Yeah, there's a really funny corollary to that, because when I was involved in an interview with Tom, I can't remember what we were interviewing, but something, I was going through an awful lot of his material he sent me, and I was reading that particular section on car keys. Now, I have a term that I use on my forum called synchronidity. And this is Synchronicity and Serendipity, where it gives you a message. And it was really funny because I just read that article and I looked on my desk as to where I'd left my car keys. And you're not going to believe this, I couldn't find them. I walked out the room and I wandered round and I came back, and about 2 hours later they were there. And I thought, good Lord, I've just read this. Thomas just... And I think, is this the cosmic Joker playing around or what? You know, and I just
well, of course, the system has a way. The system has the way of delivering opportunities to learn, and it's not a completely hands-off benign system. It does sometimes fiddle with the uncertainty to present learning situations and opportunities. So you read that, you had that in your mind, and sure enough, there it happened right in front of you. And to demonstrate the point. Now, if you hadn't been reading that and you weren't thinking about it, that demonstration may have just been an annoyance to you. It wouldn't have gone, aha, yeah, that's what he's talking about, and then it may not have happened. So things happen. Again, we're in a trainer, and this trainer is optimized as we work in it.
Tom, would you say it's optimized to each individual? So because I'm living within, the technical term within philosophical terms is my phaneron, my own worldview. So would it be logical to conclude that most of the things that happen to me are part of the training program? That, I really need to take account of the things that happen to me because they're telling me something.
Yes, it is optimized as for individuals. Matter of fact, that's primarily the way. I hate to ever use words like never and always and that sort of thing because, in a very complex system, almost anything can happen in any way. But almost all of it is individualized for the individual. It's not a group thing. This growing up, this lowering entropy, this spiritual growth thing is an individual thing. And then what we get in the group just happens to be, the sum of it all. But all of this nudging and experiences like that are delivered to individuals.
And I'm thinking about this whole idea of uncertainty again, and I don't know if this particular story is true. Maybe you guys have heard them before. I think there was in the context of talking about quantum mechanics or quantum physics and things like that, but this had to do with allegedly when some of the Native American Indians saw some of the European arrivals coming in, so to speak. They had apparently a difficult time actually visualizing or actually seeing
Can I quickly stop you there, actually? Because that is a really live, very, very odd thing. Because in my new book, I use that absolute analogy in introducing Tom's work.
There you go.
Strange.
Interesting.
Okay, do go on.
Oh, well,
what was going on there is right. They couldn't see the ship. And even though the ship was sitting there as big as life, they just couldn't see it. And the reason they couldn't see it is the way we work is with, we interpret the data. So you get data in this virtual reality, and then you interpret it. Well, if you don't have any way to interpret it, you're lost. You don't see anything. So if that was something so far outside of your experience that you had no way of, you couldn't just say it was a big canoe because it really wasn't like that, then you draw a blank. And in all the data we get, we're interpreting. We take that data and we interpret it. So that's how we create our own reality, because what we see, what's real to us, is what we interpret, and what we interpret has to do with our history, our experience, what we know, what we understand, what we've seen and done.
Yeah.
So within all the fears that we have, go into that interpretation. So that's why they couldn't see that. There was no way for them to interpret the data. The data obviously was there, but it drew a blank. And eventually they probably came to see it just fine. But that's an interpretation problem.
What that means, sorry, Anthony, I just want to wing this theory as well by both of you guys, but that could, if we just briefly look at the metaphysical point of view as well and actually look at the whole, UFO or even ET phenomena as well, it could be an explanation for that, of the weirdness, if you will, surrounding this. We could actually be looking at communication with other beings, but because of the fact that it's so incredibly foreign to us and we don't know what to expect, for us, it turns out like fragmentary little bits of information there that we can coherently interpret, but the rest is like totally foreign to us, and we don't know what to make of it. Hence, we have people coming out from that experience and just don't know what the heck has happened to them, basically. Comments on that, Anthony or Tom?
Well, what we do is... Oh, sorry,
Go ahead,
Tom.
Anthony.
I was just going to say that my background is, by training, I'm a sociologist. And one of the areas that I studied when I was at university is something called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is that, and it's very, very similar to what we were just discussing, the idea that language itself structures the way in which we interpret reality as well. So, in fact, there is the idea that because we don't have words to describe certain things, we don't perceive them, because our brains are structured in a certain way to work within certain language constraints. But this is then an interesting point that you're now making in terms of when we do perceive things that are outside of our cognitive facility to structure internally, we don't see them. Now, there is a counter-argument here to say, and again on my forum this has been discussed, and by the way, Tom is a member of my forum as well, and I know you are as well, aren't you? And one of the things that we've been discussing on there recently is the idea that even theological things, everything we perceive, because if we're structuring our own reality, therefore we will see significance, and therefore people who are religious when they have religious experiences are actually having these religious experiences, and it's profoundly difficult for those individuals to communicate to people who don't have the religious experiences that they're real. Yeah. Because, of course, if everybody's got your own reality, what is real for you is real. And it's something, again, Tom deals with, the idea of reality is what we perceive. So therefore, if somebody has a reality where they're perceiving UFOs everywhere, it is because within their reality, those UFOs are real. And going just back again to the particle physics analogy, again, it was very, very fascinating that in the 1960s, when they were smashing the particles in various places, they kept finding more and more particles. And I think it was some very, very famous particle physicist, and I can't quite remember his name now, who suggested this, that it seems as if they would think about the particles and then they find them. And again, an example of how we manipulate our reality.
Interesting. Yes, well, what we're doing is actually pattern matching. And when we get some data, in order to deal with that data and structure it in terms of our experience, which is what we have to do in order to make it meaningful to us, we pattern match. We take that data and say, well, what does this data mean? What is it? And if we have nothing at all, and the match is just a zero, then we don't see it. But if we have something that doesn't exactly match it, but sort of matches it, then that's what we see. We do our best pattern match, and that's what we get. So if there just was a movie out and the aliens all were green with pointy ears, then you'll find that out there in the larger world, there's more green monsters with green aliens with pointy ears that are seen, because once you try to match the data, if you've seen the movie, then you might make that as a pattern match, you see. Or if you are meditating and some very seems to you wise and powerful being comes up, if you're religious, it might be Mary or Peter or somebody like that. If you're not religious, it may be just a monk or a powerful being of some sort. You may not name it, but you will interpret it by pattern matching, and then that's what's real to you. That's what you saw. That's how you interpret it. So what do we have to do is have a strong enough experience base, or a complete and detailed enough experience base, and a detailed and complete enough understanding, so that when we match these patterns, we get something that is more like the original data that we're getting, and not quite so fanciful, because we really don't have anything to match it with. So you get better and better at this interpretation the more you learn.
The question as well, in terms of reality, Tom, that might be contradictory a little bit to this idea then, is if we look at this from the point of view of if we go back into history, far back into the time of history, when it seems like people who were living at that time had a more magical, if I can use that word, approach to reality, the magic of the land. They were seeing spirits in everything. They were even seeing ghosts. They could communicate with beings in the forest, what have you. But it seems that humanity has slowly lost that ability in one sense, because we've had the, if you will, slow implementation of the scientific model, and also the part of that, the religious arm earlier, we have been told what is real and what it isn't. We have been, in one way, we're being more and more limited, I guess, in that sense. That's what I'm saying, and therefore we also now lack the ability to, in one sense, think outside the box and see that things have a spirit to them, if you will, in that sense, because we have been told what exists and what doesn't exist, and we also, when we end up believing that, we're actually kind of cutting off those aspects of ourselves which actually could be, let's say, in contact with a more spiritual life, if you know what I mean. So, do you feel, Tom, that that's is that a counter argument to what we just talked about? Yeah.
No, that is an argument in favor of what we just talked about. That is absolutely true. Beliefs are limiting. If you have a belief, then that limits the way you can interpret data, because you will always interpret it within the confines of that belief. Therefore, you always find what you're looking for in that sense, or it always turns out to be the way you thought it was, because that's your limitation.
Yeah.
And absolutely. So you have people in earlier times who were more open, did not have the beliefs that we have now. Then they may have had other beliefs, but they didn't have the this is an objective reality and those little spirits don't exist, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't have that, so they could use those things as metaphors to explain what it was they were getting. So they could have had a much larger, what can we call it, decision space, a much larger set of data coming to them, because they could interpret it as other things. Yeah. And a forest sprite or the spirit of the woods or something, that's just a metaphor for the data that they were getting, which was information that connected them to the land, to the woods, to the streams and that sort of stuff. They were communicating there as part of their environment, and they could use those metaphors, and they were perfectly, useful. And we can't do that anymore because those metaphors are silly now, and nobody will pay any attention to them. So as a result, we have a much harder time connecting to that woods,
That's right.
That stream or whatever, because we no longer have the metaphors to us, because those metaphors conflict with our beliefs. So that's and we'll make different metaphors. We will talk in terms of ambience and the feel you get in the deep forest.
Right.
But we can't say, I communed with the spirit of the deep forest, because then we'd be silly. But we can say that we, commune with the ambience of the this and that, and, we're trying to say the same thing, whereas people in an earlier time could state it more directly because they didn't have beliefs that made that off limits.
No.
So yes, the information's always there.
Anthony, I wanted to ask you as well, how do you see this connect with the whole, if we look at this from the point of view of hallucinogenic substances, we last time you were with us, we talked about DMT, obviously, we could talk about LSD or some of the other ones that are out there as well, psilocybin, what have you. There's all different kinds of compounds and so forth, and how they interact with us, and also what they open up with us, in us rather, and what we can get in contact with. From that point of view, do you agree with Tom? And do you think maybe that there are actually these, if we talk about beings or what have you, or spirits or energies, actually are out there, but we've been cut off? But in certain instances where we, for instance, do DMT substances or what have you, we can actually get in contact with these forces, if you will. Again, what's your take on this, Anthony?
Well, the first thing is, going back to the comment about in times gone by, the way in which people were more in tune to dyads and various other beings of the forest and such like. If you read some of the earlier books, I think one book that leaps to mind is that there's a guy called Patrick Harper, who I've been in contact with, and he very much has a similar idea to my own in terms of the daemon, and he considers demonic reality to be something external to ourselves that's out there, that exists, that we can't attune to, because we have the way we define our world is more difficult for us to attune to this. Now, of course, there have been people. John Keel in the 1960s wrote an amazing book called Project Trojan Horse, and this was the idea about UFOs manifesting themselves throughout the generations with whichever archetype that seemed to fit into that particular civilization. And it is clear that there are external archetypes that do seem to carry on through the generations. Now, you're touching there upon DMT, and effectively, as you're probably aware, I'm quite fascinated by the work of Rick Strassman. and what Rick is doing in terms of opening up these channels of communication, or what he did do in his research in the early 90s, in terms of opening up individuals by using dimethyltryptamine to open up the communication channels, the portal, for want of a better term, into alternate realities. Now, I know that Tom again will agree with this from his experiences and out-of-the-body experiences, that what tends to happen when you go into these exomatic states, whether we call them intramatic, extramatic, or whether we call them external within the consensual reality or whatever, that when you're out there you will meet other beings, and these beings seem to have motivations in external ways, and they seem external to the person who's observing. Now, how this can be, we know that, and again, Tom is more of an expert on this, but you look at Robert Monroe and the incidents he had when he encountered beings in these places, the beings that helped him, the beings when he travelled in Locale 3, and when he met Ivor, which seemed to be a mirror image of himself. These things clearly seem to be manifested in some way when certain channels within the neurological constructs of the brain are opened. Now, this could be, I think, that DMT and such like, using probably something called Bose-Einstein condensates and deep structures in the brain called microtubules, are opening up the channels of communication with the Akashic record, with the 0 point field. So in other words, individuals, when they use these mind-altering drugs, are opening up portals, possibly something that is technically known as Einstein-Rosen bridges, which actually pulls consciousness into many black holes and takes you into the Akashic record, into the 0 point field, into the digital world that Tom talks about. And I sometimes suspect that when people astral travel and when they have out-of-the-body experiences, these are the places they go to. This is why it is not quite consensual reality. There are subtle differences. And I'd be interested to have Tom's opinion on that. I know, because Tom and I have discussed this many times, as to when you are in an out-of-the-body state like that, where are you actually going? You out there in consensual reality, or are you somewhere different?
Okay, you know, the language is a problem here. When you say, where do you go? You
Correct.
see, just the word go infers logically a place that's different from where you are now.
I agree.
See, and if we are not these physical bodies are just virtual, but we think in terms of place because that's the way this virtual reality is. So the language is difficult. You don't really go anywhere in a sense, is that you just switch to a different data stream. You let the data stream defining this virtual reality go, and from your awareness, and you plug into a data stream that's belonging to some other virtual reality going on. So it's not that you're traveling and going, it's that you are just, you have a larger perspective that can take in more than just this one data stream that we're kind of stuck with here. So that's one thing. Another thing is when we, even talking about okay, Bob ran into these beings, and we were talking about the forest sprites, perhaps, or maybe the leprechauns. All those things are metaphors. The higher self, the oversoul, these are metaphors. So the forest sprite was a metaphor for those people who were getting data that connected them to the land, connected them to the forest. And they interpret then that as a forest sprite. But what happens is that then because we are in this world with this language that makes everything separate, we start saying things, well, do these beings really exist? They're just metaphors. It's not so much that they're beings, it's data that we interpret that way. Now, when you are out in the exploring this larger reality, yes, you run into beings. It doesn't mean that there are, like zombies wandering, through the netherworld. That's an interpretation. That's a metaphor. What happens is that you get data, and when this data communicates with you, you interpret that as a being, because that's what it, back and forth conversation. Hello, how are you? what's up, that sort of thing. That's how you talk to another being. You don't talk like that to rocks or trees. They're beings. So anything that shares information with you is automatically a being, and that's how you interpret it. So it's not, again, think of this as a large information data field, the larger consciousness system. It's all one thing, and we are interacting with it. And as we get data, we interpret it. So we have to do that. We have to interpret it, and then we put it into metaphors that we can use in our language that we can then talk to each other. Otherwise, we would have an experience that was just non-communicatable. And in fact, that happens some. You mentioned the religious experience. Some people have the religious experience and they say, well, tell me what it was like. And they say, I can't. It's undescribable. Well, the reason it's undescribable is that they don't have any common metaphors that they can use to describe it. It was outside of their experience base, and they just can't describe it. It's just something that happened. I can tell you sort of what it felt like, but even that description of sort of what it felt like is just a shadow of what it really was like. So the beings out there are our metaphors for data sources that are interactive with us, because that's what we call them. And we can give them names, and we can visualize faces. We can do all that kinds of thing. But I keep trying to push it up to a bigger perspective to where we're not taking our perspective here in this trainer, where we have a rule set that gives us this 3D spatial reality frame in this virtual reality, and then give the larger reality those same attributes. So where there's a being, then there's an individual up there, and and they must have a body, and they must do this and that. So it's just data. We're interacting with the larger system. And yes, some of this data is always repeatable. When I say it's just data, it doesn't mean that everything's random. You can go up and interact with that being many times. I have some very good non-physical friends, if you will, beings that I have interacted with for 30 years. And it is consistent. You can have a consistent interface with a larger consciousness system. It's a little different. Yeah, it's so common that we project our reality, our little reality here on the larger reality. But
I think this is something that when I was listening to your previous interview on Red Ice, that it very much intrigued me, and I was very much madly nodding in agreement with this. And the idea of how difficult it is to get across the concept that there is a reality outside, but it's a reality. It's not within us or without of us. It's more inclusive than that. So these things that we experience are part of our inner psychology and our external psychology. And I love your point, because one of the things I say in my first book about when people have near-death experiences and the being of light that they experience, when they start to die and suddenly there's this being in front of them that manifests itself. And effectively, as you rightly said in your previous interview, these beings will manifest themselves in the way that you are at ease with. So if you are a particularly religious person, it could be Jesus. If you're of another tradition, it could be something else. I mean, I have examples where people who have had near-death experiences where the being of light has manifested itself as Elvis Presley. Really seriously. Sometimes it's somebody's pet dog, and many, many times with children particularly, the being of light is a school friend or a school teacher who's still alive. Mm-hmm. So clearly what is happening here is it's the database reacting in a way to make you feel at ease because you're in a state of trauma or whatever, that you want something there to make you feel at ease. And I would argue that a lot of the manifestations, for instance, when you were talking earlier about this, I was thinking shamanic traveling. And in my new book, I have a section on shamanic traveling, and the idea that when somebody shamanic travels, the first thing they look for is their totem when they're in the shamanic world. And of course, the totem will be whatever they want it to be, and it will be their teacher. But it's a reciprocal teaching relationship, and they are sort of out there in a kind of alternate reality, but they're not. It's much more complex than that, and I think it's very much again where Tom and I have so much in common is the idea that it's very difficult to get across the idea that reality is a reality, but it's not a reality that we can necessarily appreciate just how complex it is.
Anthony, I was thinking about something else. You talked, well, you mentioned it in the context of trauma in one way, and I would compare this to, I guess, the level of emotional impact that, let's say, an experience might be that you're having. And this connects with the idea that we might look at this from the point of view of different realities or different timelines, if you will, and how much they might impact and influence us as well. If we think at this from the point of view of a, let's say, dream precognitions, even prophecy, if we can use that term, or people who are prone to, see doomsday happening further down the road or what have you. Do you think that could be a big force, that it might be something that is on the horizon in an alternate reality, if you will, but we're prone to connect this with our current reality and think that, on the, whatever date this and that is going to happen, or how do you view that, Anthony?
It's an intriguing point, that, because there are a few members of my group and people that email me who regularly have precognitions about events. And it is intriguing that sometimes these events do come to place as described. But effectively, sometimes the very fact that the individuals vocalize to other people that these events are likely to take place somehow stops the events happening. I deal a lot with people who experience temporal lobe epilepsy. And it is known, if you look at the neurological records, that people that have temporal lobe epilepsy, it used to be known as the diviner's disease, because I would say that the particular neurological constructs of these individuals facilitate an access to what I would call the demonic worldview. And of course, if your daemon knows your own future, by accessing the information that your daemon has, you will know the future. But effectively, that is an alternate future. And as Tom would say, it is a potential future. It is a temporal wave that could potentially be collapsed by the act of observation or may not. So therefore, sometimes they will say to me, like, for instance, there's some people that have precognitive deja vu sensations, and it's quite intriguing what they say to me. And they say, if I have a precognitive deja vu, I say, well, why don't you turn around to the people and say you've just had this precognitive deja vu? And they turn around to me and say, if I said that, the person would not do what my precognition and my precognitive deja vu had told me they would do, which, of course, it's true, which is coming back to physics and the idea of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The idea, if you observe a particle, and the act of measurement of a particle will change its momentum and its speed. So you can never observe a particle in a particular way. And this is almost like if the future is particulate, or it's a wave function, the very act of observing it changes it in one way or another. And this, again, comes back to Tom's digital analysis, that the future is a potential, and there's millions of potential futures, but there's only one that's actualized. Again, it's interesting from Tom's point of view on that.
You can comment on this, Tom, obviously, but does this have another function in that sense, do you think, that if we, if people are focusing on this or trying to work with the material, if you will, that they've been given in terms of precognition, that they actually successfully might change things? Or in another question would be, how can we distinguish between what will be the real thing and what is this alternative reality, if you will?
Well, the way you distinguish that is, again, you have to have experience. Otherwise, you get the wrong interpretations. Getting to these other reality systems, the out-of-body, the getting into these databases, it's really, people kind of look at me oddly when I say this, but it's really a very simple thing to do. It's just a matter of switching data stream, and people do this off and on just naturally anyway. Learning how to focus it and maintain it, I guess, is the challenging part. So people can get into this database because they have an interest in it, because they have an intent to find this data. That's why they go there. They're going into the probable future database. But if they don't really have a lot of experience, they may bounce around in that and not realize that they're not in the what's most likely to happen. They're in, something that is a much lower probability, could happen, but probably won't, because it's all there. So first they have to have an intent to be there. Then they have to have the intent of how, what data they want to see and in what order they want to see it in. You have to be very specific about that. Otherwise you get a lot of, you get a lot of data, but you can't really make much sense out of it. And then Tony was right. If you go back and you say, oh, George, I just had this vision and I saw that you did something. Well, now you've changed things. Now, because George now has information he didn't have, what he will probably do the probabilities of it all change, you see, because you've got new information. So the system is recursive, and it does change itself like that. And also the system, again, like I say, is trying to help us learn lessons. So sometimes it will hand a lesson to you if you're doing something that's particularly, let's say you're bragging about some particular ability that you have, and after you've stood up and bragged in a bunch of people, the very next time you try it, of course, in front of those people, it fails, right? Well, it wasn't that you hexed it by talking about it. It's that you set yourself up for a lesson. So that's the way those sorts of things work. So it's just a probable future reality, but you need to realize that you have to be specific about how you put queries into the database, or you get junk back. If you go to Google and you say, pick something like love, sex, any of those words, what happens? You get, you get 30 million replies back, all sorts of ways. That some might be interesting and some not. But if you're very, very specific, then you're more likely to get what you're looking for. And it's the same in the larger database. Most people don't understand how it works. They don't have a lot of experience, so they're not specific. So they tend to jump around and be a little unreliable. That's usually what's going on.
Tom, there's another question I wanted to ask you, and that has to do with if we, and we collectively, humanity in that sense, officially accept the current, model, if you will, that we're discussing here as reality. Do you think that that reality will change at that point as well, much in the same way that we have the techies and the transhumanists are looking for a kind of a technological singularity, almost, that the system itself attains some kind of self-enlightenment almost in that sense, meaning that because if we understand that this is how reality works, then we can begin to interact with reality in a different way. We can also get a different experience maybe out of the reality. In other words, do you think that that would mean an incredible change in all of our lives? What do you think about that?
That could mean a change. Of course, we are the ones creating it, so we can change it. And what keeps us not changing it, of course, is the beliefs that we have, inability to think bigger thoughts, see bigger pictures. So we're kind of trapped in this little picture because we can't think outside the box. So yes, if we understood this thing, if we understood that why we were here was to, become love, that it was a spiritual, reality, if you will, it's, the point and purpose. If people really understood that and let go of the beliefs that constrain them. And any belief is a constraint. There is no such thing as a belief that's not a constraint. If you believe anything, it's a constraint. So, yes, if you release those constraints and gave people a bigger picture, certainly there's a lot of feedback. And there is this thing of kind of like the group mind, if you will, where one person encourages another. One person says, oh, I did this and it was wonderful. Then the other person is positively disposed toward it and is more likely to try it than if the opposite had happened. And yes, we encourage each other. So things tend to spiral up and spiral down on this kind of group consciousness based on kind of feedback. Just like you go to that state we said, you go to a probable reality, you go back and say, hey, Fred, what I saw you doing this afternoon was, well, now you've changed things because you've introduced new information into the system. Well, you can change things in a positive direction or a negative direction. And that change can be what in electrical engineering is called positive feedback. In other words, the change feeds more change. So you can get into spirals, positive and negative that way. So yes, you could have a lot of progress kind of all of a sudden just really because quick. You have a bigger picture. That's
interesting. Anthony, following that line of thinking, I'm thinking about other kinds of phenomena that we see and have detailed, like the 100th monkey effect, for instance, might mean also that if we're going down that particular road, it's not necessary perhaps that everybody out there have to come to this kind of conclusion, but it's kind of going to spread to mass effect, if you will, just because of the fact that many people have an understanding that this is how things are being run. Comments on that, or what Tom just said, Anthony?
Yeah, no, very much so. One of the things that I'm very intrigued in at the moment, and that somebody who's now looking into my work, is a guy called Rupert Sheldrake. And Rupert Sheldrake has a concept called morphic resonance. And morphic resonance is the idea that it's almost like the idea that certain ideas take on a role of their own, that society itself can change by the amount of individuals that will believe certain things in certain ways. And this is an extremely powerful idea, that again, if we are living in this feedback system, and if society, both the individuals within society and society generally, is living within this feedback, we can change things by collectively willing it to be the case. Now, I know that the transcendental meditation guys argue that you can do that if you have something like 15% of the population in any particular area using transcendental meditation, it will bring down the crime rate. Now, I don't know whether that exercise ever really worked. I've heard it has, but I've never seen any hard data on it. But it still goes to show that the collective consciousness, in a more precise term than a sociological term, we're not talking here about collective consciousness in the terms of even a Jungian way. We're talking about something that, using Tom's model, can actually be very, very powerful, because what we're doing is we're collectively, as we are part of a greater something, effectively the more of us that think in a particular way will by necessity change the reality around us. You know, and I'm not a great fan of things like the intention experiment, but these things are good ideas, and they're manipulating reality positively in a positive way, and things we should be thinking about for the future.
Good point.
Yes, we're all connected. We're all on all consciousness is basically of one thing, and therefore it's all on a net. So we're all netted like a giant internet. I call it the reality wide web in my book. But we're all on this net, and we're all sharing data. So as you know, the experiences that one has can affect the experiences that another has. It is an interactive kind of thing. We're not all isolated, separate beings who only communicate with acoustic vibrations and visual signals. We're also all part of the same consciousness thing, and we're all sharing data, and that's kind of the root, if you will, of empathy, that kind of thing. We're sharing this data all the time, and yes, you do have this 100th monkey effect in the sense that we're all netted. So what one person does and says and thinks has some influence over what others do. That's why often people who will go hang out with the great guru, they'll go find some master someplace, and all the time they're hanging out with them, it's all peace and light, and they feel wonderful, and then they feel like they've grown so much, and then they go back to Chicago, and get out on the street, and suddenly it's all back the way it was. Well, that's, it does work that way. And you tend to get and share with everyone, and it's not just the people in your vicinity, but with everyone. We're all part of the same thing, and those effects do happen. And Sheldrake is right. We have those kind of collective effects that grow. Unfortunately, like I said before, those effects can spiral negatively as well as positively. But we're all in this net. So, I think one of Sheldrake's experiments was with dogs knowing their masters are on their way home. Yeah. Well, of course, their consciousness too. It's not like dogs aren't conscious. Their consciousness, they're all in the same net. And they pay attention to different, data sets than we do. Sometimes, they can interpret data that our beliefs make unavailable to us. So it's just a big system that's netted and interactive.
Funnily enough, I met the lady whose dog that was that Rupert worked with, and I heard that there was an awful lot of negativity about that particular experiment, and it to me was evidential of the way in which what I would consider to be authoritarian science, when there's something like that, will find all kinds of reasons to justify it within the set that within our particular scientific paradigm, and ignore the obvious. I've seen the film of the dog, and it is clear that the dog knows that the woman is coming home, and there were all these kind of bending ways of actually justifying maybe the dog sensed it in some way. Well, no, it didn't. It just knew. Effectively, morphic resonance seemed to work. And I do feel very sorry for Rupert Sheldrake in the bad press he's had specifically in the UK, because the guy has got something very, very important to say. And let's, think outside the box, if that is possible. And I think Tom and I would both agree you can't think outside the box as an analogy. But let's just start thinking in a different paradigm way. Effectively, the whole theory of paradigm change and the idea that, there are different paradigms that replace the Thomas Kuhn thesis. I think we are on the edge of a new paradigm way of thinking at the moment. And I'd like to believe that definitely people like Dr. Campbell are very much on the route, and I would like to think in my own little way I'm contributing to this, as is Red Ice Radio. We are the people at the leading edge of all this. We're the vanguard. And let's hope that, sooner or later that morphic resonance will work its way through and more people will come to see the world as we see it.
Well, that's an interesting point, actually, because in one sense that seems to actually kind of be happening as well in that sense. And I know also that obviously the energy, the excitement, and in many cases also the love for both truth and information to get out there, if that's strong enough, then that is going to happen in one way as well. And also, of course, all of my next question doesn't mean that we have to, we don't have anything to, in terms of the scientific community, we don't have to answer to anything, to them in that sense. But I want to ask both of you, starting with you, Tom, about what you would consider to be one of the strongest points for your overarching model and theory for the potential skeptics, if you will, out there in that sense. Many of the things we've been talking about, like out-of-body, meditation, remote viewing, or spirits, or interaction with these other realms, can be kind of, a bit esoteric for perhaps many people, specifically if you're coming from the skeptic's point of view in that sense. But active observation, quantum mechanics, what would you say to a person who's like totally skeptic towards all of this that we've been talking about, Tom?
Well, your question of what is your strongest kind of evidence? What makes you feel like you've got the right answer? And I'm a big believer in open-minded skepticism, and I think you always must be skeptical. If you're not skeptical, you're liable to end up on some imaginary path that doesn't actually exist. Skepticism is necessary. I differentiate between a belief and skepticism. If you're open-minded, then you look at all the data, and when I present this model, I look at it as a physicist as well as based on my experience. And that means that whether a model's good or not shouldn't be how well it matches the accepted theory.
Exactly.
But whether a model's good or not is whether or not it, can answer questions and do it with very few assumptions, and can it predict new things? Does it solve problems that otherwise can't be solved? And all of the quantum weirdness that everybody talks about, my model of looking at the way the world works basically will predict all of those experiments. The experiments where they all the double slit variations, and there's lots of that sort of stuff, and it predicts those. It says, yes, this is the way it'll happen. Here's why it happens. And right now, physicists know that it happens that way, but they have no idea why. Physicists have no idea why you should represent a particle as a probability distribution in order to be able to correct, right answers. That's what quantum mechanics is all about. They just know that if you do that, it works. But, so I come with a theory that actually explains, why particles really are probability distributions. There is no such thing as a particle, they're probability distributions. And that is kind of an organic thing. So quantum mechanics then has an explanation that it didn't have before. Another thing in science that is a mystery is, why is the speed of light a constant? We know that it is. It seems to be that way. Einstein told us that was true. But everything else we know of in this physical world, velocities are additive. You're in a car going 10 mile an hour. You throw a ball 10 mile an hour in the direction the car's going, and the ball actually is going 20 mile an hour because the velocities add. That's in all of our experience. That works, except for one thing, and that's light. If you're in a car going 20 mile an hour and you shine a light in the direction of the car, it just goes C, speed of light, no matter how fast you're going. It doesn't add. And that constancy of the speed of light is a big mystery. And my theory, virtual reality and so on, derives why that C should be and is constant. So there's two big mysteries of physics that it solves. And then let's go to things like that Pear Lab's doing, where they use intent to modify probabilities of things. So they generate two bunches of random numbers, and so they have this set A and set B of random numbers all came out of the same random number generator, and you can have people use their intent, and sure enough, the one that they intend to have a little higher average for the random number will have a little higher average. Now it's real small because it has to be within the uncertainty, but that can be done. It can be done consistently. And the reverse causality experiments, where they have a Geiger counter on either side of a radioactive source, and they'll take that data, and then years later, they'll have people modify which Geiger counter got the higher count, and they can modify it. They can make a Geiger counter be higher or lower, either one, based on on the data that they're given. It's called reverse causality. There's a whole bunch of experiments that do that sort of thing, and my theory explains exactly why that should work. It predicts it. It even predicts new experiments that could be done that have never been done, and it says how they would come out. So you can predict new things with it. So basically, the reason that, to me, that it's a good theory is that it predicts what we know. It makes future predictions that are measurable, data, experiments that could be done to verify it, and it provides answers where there are none now. Well, and from a basic scientific viewpoint, that's the definition of a good theory. So that's kind of the point. It answers the mail and explains things that otherwise are not explained, and it also, of course, explains all the paranormal things, this morphic field, all this other stuff that has been documented over and over again, and the near-death experiences and all of that then also makes sense. It also makes sense about precognitive dreams. It also makes sense about here's one that everybody knows about that is the big mystery, and that's with medicine, at least in some countries, and I think UK and US are in that group, as well as most of European. You cannot get a medicine out unless it passes the placebo test. Placebo test says you give people the medicine you're trying to sell and the sugar pills, and if the medicine doesn't do any better than the sugar pills, then you can't sell it. It's denied to go on the market. That's called the placebo effect. The placebo effect is well known, has been documented hundreds of times, and it's not just that people think they're better, when they take the sugar pill. They actually get better. So my model tells you how the placebo, it predicts that sure, placebo effect will work. So there's all these things out in our reality that it predicts and explains. That's why I think it's basically a good model. And for me as a scientist, that's what, as I put this model together, kind of made it more and more credible in my own mind, is that simply it works.
All right, that's excellent. Thanks for that, Tom. How about you, Anthony? Would you agree with Tom on these notes, or do you have anything else to add, either if that has to do with weirdness or whatnot? Go ahead.
I would totally agree with Tom in the sense that any big toe, any grand theory of everything has to do exactly as it states on the box, in the sense that it has to be an explanator of everything that we understand to be out there, and the great enigmas and the great problems. And again, I'd agree with Tom, some of the things like the placebo effect have to be explained, because it clearly is something that consistently takes place, and it doesn't fit within the present paradigm. Again, I agree with Tom about the idea of the twin slit experiment, and the idea, how something can be a particle and can be a wave, and how it can be that if you place a measuring device at the point where the wave goes through the slits. Effectively, if you have a measuring device, the particle will go through one or other of the slits. But if you take the measuring device away, it will go through both slits and show a wave function again. Now, clearly, that is simply impossible, and until science can explain things like that, until they can explain David Chalmers' hard problem, where does consciousness come from? How can inanimate, effectively, if you take things back within the brain is made up of inanimate electrons, it's made up of molecules that are made up of inanimate matter. which then collectively become organic matter. But how does that generate the consciousness that we see around us? How does it generate an inner dialogue? How does it generate self-referential thought? It doesn't. It can't even begin to do that. So clearly there's a problem with the modern scientific paradigm. Now, I'm coming very much from the neurological viewpoint, and in my latest book, I'm dealing with something I call the intramatic model. And I'm applying Bose-Einstein condensates, I'm applying coherent light, I'm applying Einstein-Rosen bridges and DMT, and the potential generation of DMT within the pineal gland, which gives access to alternate realities that Tom talks about. Now, I believe this model works. Now, I do not, but my ideas are not as far advanced as Tom's, so I don't call them a theory, I call them a hypothesis. But effectively, given time and with the people I'm working with, we will be able to measure it, at least get it as far as a theory. And with what Tom's doing, what I'm doing, and with what some other people I'm in contact with doing, we will change the worldview. And I think that we are trying to explain the questions that nobody else, or the questions that nobody else are even addressing. And I think it's profoundly important we do that. And I think that, I'm very, very excited what's going to be happening over the next few years with people like ourselves who are really pushing the boundaries and are coming up with models that work and explain the greatest mystery of all, what consciousness is.
Absolutely. And until they also, obviously, the mainstream science can explain some of these anomalies that we've been pointing out during this program, and many others, of course, as well. And there's a number of other ones out there that we haven't even had time to talk about. But in that sense, their responsibility, if you ask me, in that sense, is that they should have a little bit more open mind and be kinder to people who are actually exploring these types of topics. But I mean, Max Planck said it. He said a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. So, maybe that's what we're faced with here. I don't know, but I think it would be a good idea to
I'm not quite sure what you're advocating there.
No, not that we, no. Nature takes care of itself. The experiment knows what it's doing, right? That's the idea here. Let's talk a little bit about the websites, both of you guys' websites, and give out some detail here at the end, obviously, so that we can relay people, our listeners, further to the information that you have out there. Why don't we begin with you, Anthony? AnthonyPeake.com, that's the main website you do have out there currently, right now, and available through the website. The book The Damon, and also Sheeting the Ferryman. Either if you want to tell us a little bit about that, your website, or what you're working on currently, Anthony, go ahead.
In terms of my website is www.anthonypeake.com. That's Anthony with an H and Peake.com. I also have an extremely active forum on there, and as I mentioned earlier, Tom is a member of that forum. I've got lots of other individuals. I've got Robert Wagner on there, who's one of the world's leading authorities on lucid dreaming. I have quite a few lucid dreamers on there. I have Robert Bruce on there, who's an astral traveller. And we are building up the model on there because I've got some of the major individuals around the world who are writing on this subject. In terms of my books, you can get my books in the UK and in America. You can get them in many bookshops. You can also get them on Amazon, and you can buy them directly from my site. And if you buy them from my site, I will sign them and send them out as well. But my real thing is, I really want you guys on my forum, and that's anthonypeake.com/forum. We really are making a difference on there, and we're bringing up some very, very fascinating ideas. So that's where I'd like to see you guys as well.
All right, excellent. AnthonyPeake.com. We will have the links up on redicecreations.com. And obviously then we have Tom Campbell's website, My Big Toe, standing for Theory of Everything, TOE. And obviously you have the book out there, the trilogy as it is, My Big Toe as well. Loads of YouTube videos that we talked about last time as well, Tom, in terms of what people can do to get familiar with your particular model or theory, or how we want to name that. But anything else you have going right now, Tom? You're speaking quite a bit as well, aren't you?
Yes, I do get around from time to time to places. But I guess if you're interested in the things that you hear and you want to know more, that's kind of the gap we're filling here. Where do you go if you want more information? It's the www.mybigtoe.com is my website. And from there, you can find a lot of interesting things. There is also a forum that is quite busy most of the time that you can click on if you go to that website. Also, there's a set of papers that I use actually is to get discussions going in my workshops that I do as I travel around. And you go to the forum and you'll see a thing that says workshop slides and gems from the forum. Go read those gems. You'll find those interesting. And the last thing is YouTube. If you go to YouTube and search on TWCJR, then my YouTube site will pop up. And right now what's on top is a video of a workshop I did in Hawaii. It comes in 3 pieces. Each piece is 2 hours. And, of course, that means a whole lot of little 10-minute segments. But the first piece is theory. It goes through all the things we just talked about, pulls together the whole theory of how things work, what reality is, how do we relate to it, how does science work. Goes into a little physics and metaphysics both, derives things. And then the next piece is just questions, people asking questions about what I said. And then the third piece is called experiential exercises, is where I lead the group to help them experience and be able to do things like mental healing, remote viewing, out of body, these kinds of things. So if you'd like to join in on those experiential exercises and kind of get a sense of how would you go about doing those things yourself, then you can go to that part. So that's what I would give people. Though there's a lot more out there. You'll find that YouTube site has lots and lots of stuff on it, but those would be the places to go look and gather more information. After that, you can kind of explore others as your interest dictates.
Right, excellent. Find all the links on redicecreations.com as well. Well, this has been a real treat, obviously, to have both of you gentlemen on at the same time here, and we're happy that we've been able to facilitate a program of this interview with both of you. First, Anthony, thank you so much for your time. Keep up the great work, and I hope we can have you back soon.
Thank you very much. It's been absolutely fantastic meeting your minds, just as I expected it would be. I've really enjoyed it.
Excellent. And same to you, Tom Campbell. Thank you so much for your time, and keep up the great work to you as well.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's been my pleasure. Always enjoy talking, and particularly with somebody of the caliber of Anthony, who brings a lot to the table. And you also, Henrik, are a very good interviewer. I like your style and the way you lead the conversation. So it's been a very pleasant experience. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tom. And obviously, we'd like to have you back in the future as well. But for now, we're wrapping up. Thanks both to Anthony and Tom, and we will be back with more